welcome to China's living legends.
Imagine a family so poor that they're quite literally starving one week and then gorging themselves the next.
Right, just completely at the mercy of a single rainstorm.
Exactly. Now imagine that this exact family of, mud-soaked farmers living in just utter obscurity is about to fundamentally rewrite the history of the largest empire on Earth.
It's honestly wild to even think about.
It is, because, when we look back at history, we have this really profound tendency to assume that the people who changed the world just sort of arrived on the scene fully formed.
Yeah, like they step onto the grand stage already draped in power and wealth.
Right, or at least with some obvious, undeniable destiny. But today's deep dive into 19th century China is going to completely shatter that illusion for you.
It really shatters it by forcing us to look at the unglamorous, brutal reality of where power actually originates. We're looking at the origins of the Zeng family today.
Yeah.
It's a historical trajectory that was chronicled by the towering intellectual Liang Qichao.
And our mission today is to use this incredibly specific historical case study as a window into a universal human struggle. We really want to explore how exceptional individuals actually rise from absolute zero.
Which is fascinating. Uncovering those hidden psychological engines that drive them out of the mud. And ultimately how history judges them.
Because if you have ever made a deeply unpopular decision, right? If you've ever felt like you were doing the right thing while everyone around you was telling you were crazy, the framework we're exploring today is going to change how you see your own life.
Definitely. And what's fascinating here is that to really grasp this, we have to challenge almost everything you might assume about popularity, the true nature of poverty, and well, what raw, world-altering ambition actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, because the inception of historical greatness is almost never recognized by the people actually living through it.
Oh, no, never.
And nobody understood that misunderstanding better than Liang Qichao himself. He was a monumental figure in modern Chinese intellectual history.
Huge figure, yeah.
And he opens his biography of the statesman Li Hongzhang with an observation that is, honestly, it's just stark. He paints this vivid philosophical picture stating, quote, "The world is populated by mediocrity's men without remorse, without desire."
It's such a heavy quote. He deeply believed that truly exceptional individuals are incredibly rare.
Right. And he makes this fascinating argument that universal acclaim does not equate to moral integrity, just as universal condemnation doesn't erase greatness.
Exactly.
But wait, okay, let's unpack this for a second. If a leader is universally hated, shouldn't we just assume they are actually, a bad leader?
You would think so, yeah.
Right. It feels highly counterintuitive to say that a chorus of boos might actually signify a profound historical contribution. Why does Liang argue that being despised might actually be a hallmark of a great leader?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of his specific era, the logic becomes pretty undeniable. Liang was a reformer, and he was actively watching the Qing Empire slowly decay from the inside out.
It's falling apart.
Exactly. He was surrounded by massive institutional stagnation and pervasive corruption. So, in that specific environment of a dying empire, he developed a deep-seated disdain for what he called the Xiangguan.
Oh, the hypocritical conformists.
Yes.
People pleasers who just nod their heads and go along to get along, right?
And they do it strictly for self-preservation. To Liang, a collapsing society doesn't need people pleasers. It desperately needs leaders with a genuine moral compass.
Someone who actually has the courage to act unpopularly.
Right, because when the status quo is fundamentally broken, the act of fixing it is going to make you an enemy of everyone who profits from that broken system.
Wow, yeah, that makes total sense.
Liang knew that for deeply complex figures of his era men, like Li Hongzhang and Zeng Guofan, definitive historical judgment just cannot be rendered in their lifetimes.
Because the public opinion of the day is heavily biased by immediate discomfort.
Exactly. It takes centuries for the dust to settle, and for the true structural impact of their unpopular decisions to be understood.
Wait, this sounds exactly like what was happening in Europe and America around the exact same time. Weren't Western governments going through a massive crisis trying to weed out those exact same people pleasers from their ranks?
Yes. This actually mirrors the late 19th and early 20th century push for meritocracy in Western civil service reforms perfectly.
Oh, interesting.
Across the United States and Europe, there was this massive structural effort to dismantle the old systems of patronage. the spoils system.
Where politicians just handed jobs to their friends and sycophants.
Exactly. Because a government run by sycophants eventually collapses under the weight of its own incompetence.
Which was precisely the fear.
Right. Western institutions were desperately trying to implement rigorous, standardized examinations to find genuine, capable leaders, just as China had utilized its imperial examination system for centuries.
So both Liang's philosophical writings and these Western institutional reforms were trying to solve the exact same human problem.
Yes, how do you discern true, effective merit from superficial, smiling popularity?
It's like the difference between being really well-liked at the office party and actually saving the company from bankruptcy.
That's a great way to put it.
And that is a huge warning for you listening today. The human tendency is to categorize and simplify in real time. We want the good guys in white hats and the bad guys in black hats right now.
But popular opinion is a terrible, highly volatile metric for true significance. History compels us to resist that easy categorization.
Which explains exactly why Liang Qikao didn't look at emperors born into massive wealth to find the ingredients of true greatness.
No, he didn't?
If exceptionalism is so rare and so frequently misunderstood, where does it actually come from? To find out, we have to leave the high-minded philosophy behind and travel into the mud. The year is 1808 CE.
The 13th year of the Jia Qing reign.
Right. Picture this. A family of about a dozen people bearing the surname Zeng have just packed up whatever meager belongings they have, and they settle in a place called Baimoping.
Which is a remarkably secluded, highly isolated village.
Yeah, located 130 Lai, which translates to roughly 40 miles south of Shangshan County. They are not wealthy. Socially, they rank modestly below the middle stratum of local society.
Which, in the context of 19th century rural China, means they were living incredibly close to the edge of ruin.
Right. The patriarch of this family is a man known as Jinshi. He's 60 years old, he has this flowing white beard, and despite their dire circumstances, he's described as having this aura of serene transcendence.
Yeah, even though their ancestral home was in Hengyang, where generations of their forebears had been farmers.
And their existence was defined by a brutal seesaw of survival. One good harvest meant they survived the winter. One bad rainstorm meant absolute starvation.
They were perpetually trapped in the agrarian cycle of poverty.
But wait, so why does that matter? How does a random family, barely surviving and moving 40 miles into the middle of nowhere, connect to the bigger picture of exceptionalism? I mean, a dozen people relocating to a muddy village doesn't exactly scream future architects of history.
True. But it matters because of the crushing socioeconomic pressures of the Qing dynasty at that specific moment. This relocation to Baimoping wasn't some casual change of scenery for better farming.
Right, it was survival.
It was a move driven by absolute existential necessity. The empire was experiencing severe, society-breaking internal strains. You had massive land scarcity and explosive population growth.
Things the agricultural technology of the time simply couldn't support.
Exactly. Plus, they were still dealing with the fallout of the White Lotus Rebellion.
And the White Lotus Rebellion wasn't just some minor border skirmish, right? It was a massive, decades-long uprising triggered by crushing taxes and famine.
Yeah, it basically bankrupted the Qing military and scorched the earth across central China.
So the context is crucial here.
Extremely. The rebellion had devastated the economic infrastructure. It left the countryside highly unstable. So this family lacked any buffer of genuine prosperity.
When you are caught in that brutal seesaw of surviving winter to winter, one unexpected illness means total ruin.
Total multi-generational ruin. Achieving any kind of upward mobility from that specific precarious state was a monumental feat.
Because they were starting from zero. The environment itself was actively hostile to their survival.
Think of it as the 19th century version of European peasant farmers in the pre-industrial era.
Okay, let's explore that. What does that parallel actually look like on the ground?
Well, if you look at rural pre-industrial France or England, you see the exact same cyclical agrarian poverty.
Oh, right.
You see the exact same intense vulnerability to the weather, to poor harvests, and to the relentless exactions of local landlords.
And tax collectors.
Exactly. And crucially, to survive that hostility, you see the exact same reliance on strong agrarian family structures and patriarchal authority.
Just like Jinshi Gong and his absolute reverence for the family lineage.
Yes. In both the European and Chinese agrarian environments, escaping that intergenerational cycle of mud and poverty was statistically nearly impossible.
But the Zengs do escape it. And that's the core of the story, isn't it? This incredibly humble, fragile beginning is the actual crucible of greatness.
It really is.
The very act of packing up, relocating to a remote area like Beimoping, and trying to establish themselves proves their immense resilience. They weren't broken by the environment, they adapted to it.
It proves a fundamental law of history. Extraordinary historical trajectories almost always begin in the most ordinary, economically fragile circumstances.
Yeah.
The elite bureaucrats sitting in the capital of Beijing might have had the elite education and immense wealth. But the Zengs had this forged-in-the-fire reliance on the enduring power of family networks.
They knew how to survive when the system failed them.
Exactly.
But mere survival doesn't create empires. I mean, lots of families survived cyclical poverty. Millions of peasants survived the brutal winters, but they didn't fundamentally alter the course of Chinese history.
No, surviving is just the baseline.
Right. There had to be an invisible psychological engine driving the Zengs out of the mud and into the history books.
And there was. It's something the historical sources identify quite clearly, but it's very easy for a modern, highly individualized mind to deeply misunderstand.
Yes, the narrative reveals this hidden core of the Zeng family's psyche. It explicitly notes that despite their grinding poverty, despite the fact that they were barely eating, their, quote, sole aspiration was to fulfill the ancestral mandate.
The ancestral mandate. This is the key to everything that follows.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They are trapped in a cycle of poverty. They are literally worried about the weather destroying their food supply. Yet their main goal isn't just to get rich.
Right. It's not about immediate comfort.
It's not, hey, let's pool our money so we never go hungry again. It's this incredibly abstract concept of an ancestral mandate that seems almost counterproductive. When you are worried about your next meal, philosophy usually takes a backseat.
It seems abstract to us today, sure, but to them, it was the most concrete, undeniable reality of their existence. This profound philosophical underpinning is deeply, inextricably rooted in Confucian thought.
And the broader Chinese cultural worldview of the time.
Exactly. This mandate is fundamentally about intergenerational duty.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you are trapped in that brutal seesaw of surviving, how does an ancestral mandate actually translate to action? Did they just, farm harder? What is the actual mechanism here that turns a philosophy into upward mobility?
The mechanism is radical collective sacrifice. It means that your life, your labor, and your comfort are not entirely your own.
Wow.
Your obligation is to live a life worthy of the lineage, to uphold its reputation, and to ensure its continuity.
So practically speaking, what does that look like?
In practical terms, this meant a family like the Zengs would operate almost like a ruthless, highly disciplined venture capital firm. They would pool every single spare copper coin.
They would deny themselves better food or warmer clothing so they could invest it.
Yes, but not in business. They would invest it in education.
Oh, wow.
They would pick the most promising son. And while everyone else in the family broke their backs in the muddy fields from dawn until dusk, that one son would be forced to study the Confucian classics by candlelight.
He carried the weight of the entire family's sacrifice.
Exactly. His goal was to pass the brutally difficult imperial civil service examinations. If he passed, he became a government official, elevating the entire family's social and economic status.
And if he failed?
If he failed, the family's multi-generational sacrifice was entirely wasted.
That is a staggering amount of pressure. So upward mobility isn't about buying a nicer house or having luxury goods. You elevate yourself to elevate the ancestors and to secure the future of the descendants.
It is an intense, unwavering focus on long-term legacy over any form of short-term gratification. And it's a perfect parallel to Max Weber's concept of the Protestant work ethic.
Wait, this sounds exactly like what Max Weber talked about with the Protestant work ethic in Europe. Are you saying the Confucian ancestral mandate acted as the exact same kind of economic catalyst?
It functioned as the exact same psychological engine. Weber argued that the Protestant work ethic demanded diligent labor, relentless self-discipline, and the constant reinvestment of earnings.
Rather than spending them on frivolous pleasures.
Right, exactly. But, crucially, you weren't doing this just to be comfortable, you were doing it to fulfill a higher calling. In the West, that higher calling was religious salvation, proving you were chosen by God through your earthly success.
And for the Zengs in 19th century China, that higher calling was filial duty and ancestral honor.
Precisely.
The theological motivations are completely different, but the behavioral output, the insane discipline, the delayed gratification, the collective pooling of resources is identical.
I'd also liken it to the Western concept of dynastic legitimacy and the divine right of kings.
Oh, that's fascinating, comparing a poor, mud-soaked farming family to European monarchs. But you mean in terms of the ideological framework, right?
Exactly. The divine right of kings demanded a profound sense of responsibility to a lineage and its perpetuity. It provided a moral framework for societal order that extended far beyond the current ruler.
And the Confucian ancestral mandate did the exact same thing for the Zeng family, just on a microscopic scale.
Right. It dictated that their existence was part of a continuum. They were merely a link in a chain stretching back centuries into the past and projecting centuries into the future.
And that ethical framework was the true engine of their ascendancy. When you look at the actual mechanics of how they pooled their resources and sacrificed their individual desires, it proves something profound.
It proves that collective, intergenerational purpose is a far more powerful force for transformative change than individual materialism.
Because think about it, if their goal had just been to get rich, they might have stopped working the moment they had full bellies and a warm fire.
That is the crucial distinction. Individual materialism has a hard endpoint. Once you have enough comfort, the drive naturally dissipates. You relax.
But an ancestral mandate.
That is a fire that never goes out. It spans generations. It pushes a family to achieve extraordinary, world-altering things, because the finish line is literally larger than a single lifetime.
Which brings us back full circle to Liang Qiao's framework at the very beginning of this deep dive. The mediocrities he despised, the men without remorse, without desire, the hypocritical conformists. They're the ones driven only by immediate personal concerns.
Right. They want the applause today. They want the comfort right now.
And this is the master lesson we can extract from all of this.
If we synthesize everything we've looked at today, from the high-minded philosophical writings of Liang Qiao to the muddy, starving realities of Beimo Peng, the truth becomes undeniable.
True historical greatness, the kind that fundamentally transcends the mediocrity of the masses, ferments in absolute obscurity.
It never starts with a parade. It starts with bleeding hands in the soil.
Wow, yes.
It requires enduring the brutal, cyclical hardships of life, not for personal glory and certainly not for immediate reward. It is fueled by a profound intergenerational purpose.
And the most challenging part of this entire framework, the impact of that purpose, the ultimate success of that mandate, will likely take centuries for history to accurately weigh and understand.
The people who do the absolute hardest work rarely get to see the final monument built.
It's the ultimate delayed gratification. You are planting seeds for shade you will never sit in.
It requires a level of vision that most people simply refuse to cultivate.
So, what does this all mean for you listening today? We've talked about empires decaying from within, about agrarian families surviving on the absolute brink of starvation, and about philosophical mandates that span centuries.
But bring it down to the level of your own life right now.
We live in a hyper-individualistic culture. We are obsessed with the 24-hour news cycle, with going viral, with getting immediate validation on social media the second we do something remotely interesting.
We really are.
If history genuinely takes centuries to judge true exceptionalism, and if the absolute greatest achievements in human civilization are born not from the desire for immediate applause, but from a deep, enduring sense of intergenerational sacrifice, is our modern obsession with instant popularity actively destroying our capacity to build century-defining greatness?
That is a heavy question.
Are we so focused on being liked today that we are forgetting how to build something that will actually matter in 200 years? It's something to deeply consider the next time you feel frustrated that your daily efforts are going unnoticed by the crowd.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.